Good afternoon. We are here in sunny Miami, and for some strange reason, Steve is in another city. And I'm not really sure how this works because there's no Zoom screen in front of me. I think I've been Zooming since 7 this morning. So this is a welcome relief to be in a room with some actual human beings. So
Great.
thank you for being with us here today, Steve. And you have the, I think, somewhat unusual distinction of being a Florida resident, but you run a company that is listed in Canada. Tell us a little bit about how that came to be.
Yeah, well, thanks, Jane. It's great to meet you virtually. ECN is a public listed company in Canada. However, our operating subsidiaries are actually all based in Florida, but across the U.S. nation. It wasn't by design. We ended up selling off our Canadian businesses. I'm happily living in West Palm and conducting business. Florida is a great state to conduct business in.
So I'm just going to tell you that you're in the wrong county if somebody else hasn't already told you that. But you know, you're not the only Canadian who has found us. In fact, today there was the announcement that CI Financial wealth management firm is opening its U.S. headquarters here. So what are you going to do with all these other Canadians in town?
Well, there's lots of space in Florida. And we may not be in Miami-Dade, but Palm Beach County is a great spot to conduct this. We're also in Jacksonville as well, and additionally Boston and Massachusetts.
We've heard of Boston, as Manny pointed out. So let's get down to some serious business here.
Sure.
I think that if I never hear the words challenge or pivot again, it will be a little too soon for me. But I do want to talk a little bit about that C word, challenges and opportunities. I think everybody has seen a lot of those in the last year or two. And would you tell us how those have been exhibited in your own company and how you have addressed those maybe in ways that might be takeaways for other people who are struggling with some of those challenges today?
Yeah, it's a great question, Jane. And, you know, we're at the end of the day, we lend money to U.S. consumers, whether it's to improve their home or to acquire a manufactured house or their credit card. The big thing coming out of it's amazing that March 13th of 20 is when we started our operating protocols for pandemic, and here we are a year and a half later, still dealing with it. But the big lesson for me has been empathy. That we've had a number of our consumers who have borrowed money from our bank partners and us, and they've needed some forbearance. They've needed some relief, albeit early in the pandemic. But I think the big lesson for me is empathy, that we've had to learn how to address some of the consumers' concerns, to work with them, because here we are a year and a half later, and there's so much cash in the U.S. Financial services system that a lot of that early stress and uncertainty has been replaced with more certainty and lots of cash, as we know. But a great lesson in empathy and understanding.
So that's quite different, actually, from the way things at least felt in 2008 to 2010 when the bubble burst in housing. Miami, Florida was the hardest hit state. Miami did a little bit better than some other places, but really not. Why do you think that this time has felt less dire, and has it really, from a business standpoint, been less dramatic?
Yeah, I think it's another great question. I think the U.S. government acted quickly to put a series of forbearance programs in place so that people weren't moved out of their homes, that there wasn't foreclosure, that a number of things that we learned coming out of the great credit crisis, and we were much quicker to react. So I think the policies of providing for forbearance and at the same time making sure we got cash into the hands of the consumer, so within 6 to 12 weeks, they were feeling far more certain about the world. I think the reaction and the policies were spot on And I think that was the learning coming out of 08, 09, that it took us too long to respond and we didn't have enough cash.
So here we are, a little bit further down the road. We thought we would be maybe out of this by now. Alas, I am sitting in a room full of people wearing masks, so not quite yet. What's your view at this point on the U.S. economy? Some of us have gone back into stores, but Amazon still shows up at my house pretty frequently. What's your view of the economy and where the consumer is right now?
I think this most recent third wave, the Delta virus, has caused a little bit of pullback. But I would, Jane, go back and look. The initial reaction over a series of fiscal initiatives was to put $4.7 trillion into the U.S. economy, and $2 trillion of that 4.7 ended up in the U.S. banking system, where consumers either paid down debt or improved their homes or bought new homes. There's a lot of liquidity in the system. So I think the consumer is coming, if we can say we're coming out of the pandemic. I know that's not the case, but if you can say we're coming out of it, the consumer's in much better shape than they were in 2008, 2009. So I'm quite bullish on the economy, and I would make a couple observations for you. If you look to people late on paying their bills, that was the case in March and April and May in 20, the start of the pandemic. It's not the case today. We're seeing arrears, late payments at all-time lows. We're seeing almost no credit losses. We're seeing lots of credit lines available to consumers. So I think the consumer is well positioned for the recovery when we can get through the pandemic.
Many people here in the U.S., and since you live in Florida, you're certainly familiar with this. Many business owners are talking about the lack of labor shortage. I have also spent time this summer in Maine, so it's pretty much the same story there as it is here in South Florida. Some people have said too much government support, and yet we stopped the government support here, or the extraordinary federal support, in June, and I still see lots of hiring signs out there. What is going on from where you sit?
Well, we're one of the largest providers of affordable homes in the U.S. Those are, Elon Musk lives in something called a park home, which is a 500 square foot home at SpaceX now, right through to, 2,000 square foot manufactured homes. That's what we do. We provide the loans on that. And to your point, Jane, we can't get them manufactured. It's now, if you walk in to buy a manufactured home, it's a year from when you purchase it to get delivery. And what's behind that? It's at the factories, whether it's in the state of Florida or elsewhere in the U.S., where they just can't get carpenters and electricians and others back to work. And it's going to take time. And it's also exacerbated by the fact that demand has come back online so quickly. So I think we're going to see significant supply disruption, late deliveries. We have manufacturers now in the home sector that aren't taking any additional orders now for next year. They're fully booked. So I think we will see people return to work. I know that Florida, as you point out, was early to terminate some of the fiscal initiatives. Some of the other states have not. So I think as that winds down, we'll see a return to a more traditional supply system, but it's going to take time. And I think that this disruption you're seeing across the U.S. economy will continue for the next 2 to 3 quarters at least.
Well, I am interested in whether or some of the reporting we've done has indicated that some people will not go back to the jobs that they had before, that they figured out other pathways during this period. And certainly, as Manny alluded, this is a community where there are extremes of wealth. We have a very large wealth gap. And I have to say that if I were earning the minimum wage and trying to put food on the table, I would be stretched to do that. Or do you see a pathway that rewards, people who you need to have in jobs, whether it's as servers or as manufacturing associates? Is that all still going to be the same, or are we going to be looking at different jobs and different pay scales.
Yeah, I think, Jane, we're going to have to pay skilled labor, semi-skilled labor more to come back to work. And you've seen that in fast food and other services industry. We're seeing it in manufactured housing, home improvement, where labor costs are up 10, 15%. You know, the U.S. government will tell us that inflation is transitory. I happen to believe it's not. And we're going to have to pay, and as we should be paying to bring them back. So that carpenter was earning $28 an hour. They're now going to earn $35 to $37 an hour. You know, I grew up in my dad's garage. Dad was a mechanic. And I remember how hard it was on an hourly basis to do it. So I think you're going to see significant labor improvement, and we'll end up paying to bring people back to work. And I think we'll be better off. You know, we deal with the average consumer every day. Our manufactured homes are about $100,000 to $120,000 per home. So the person buying our home is not affluent. And we think I think the labor market will improve as we pay more, bring people back to work.
So let's talk about the ugly word that you brought up, the inflation word. I was at a friend's house for dinner last week, and that was actually the topic of conversation. You would think that we would have something better to talk about, but inflation reared its ugly head. And the question is, how permanent do we think it is? How transitory do we think it is? What do we think is driving it? Is it the goods that are still stuck in the port and so you can't get the building materials? Or is it a more permanent and fundamental shift?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of two things, Jane. It's labor cost increase as well as supplies. And if you look let's pick a manufactured home. The average manufactured home was $100,000 2 years ago. That same home today, exactly same home, is $115,000. So there's 15% price increase over the last 18 months. And you'd say, okay, where did that 15,000 come from? Roughly half of it is increased labor costs, and half of it is it's more for that glass that's sitting in that picture window. It's more for the tiles on the roof. All of it's supply based. And you back up through the chain, and it can be delivery cost, it can be raw goods. Seeing the same thing in our home improvement sector. If you can't get glass, we've had to create. We've directed 2 billion glass sufficient to create 2 billion vials for vaccine. All that glass went out of the system, created the vaccine. Thank goodness. So we couldn't get glass for windows and other home improvement. And it's going to be delayed, and it's going to cost 10 to 15% more, and it's not going away. It's not transient. That's my view.
Well, and it's always this, I wonder whether this is a virtual or a vicious cycle, and I'm not sure anybody has an answer to that, but I think about the guy who came to blow out my broken air conditioner this week. And he said that his tank of Freon cost $100 a year ago, and now it's $375. Okay, correct. So I'm thinking, no wonder my bill went up. But aside from that, I don't know, where do you see this going? I mean, does it go in a good direction, or is this do the numbers just change and the standard of living remains the same? Yeah,
I just lost one of my earpieces. Hopefully you can still hear me, Jane.
Oh, we can. Thank you.
Okay, great. I've been around, I've been doing this a long time, 3.5 decades. And if you go back to the 80s and you look to the level of inflation back in the 80s, we had inflation and stagflation. I think we're into a 5-10 year cycle of significant price increases, which will get passed through the consumer. And I know this week there was some data that suggested that maybe inflation was cooling off. Your example of Freon is another example of my manufactured house that's up 15%. Right. And we just got another price increase this morning for 7%. I just don't think that we're getting the real goods yet on inflation. That said, strong economy should be able to absorb a fair amount of inflation. question. My gut tells me this is a 3 to 5 year cycle, not 3 to 6 months as they're maybe suggesting to us.
Well,
your Freon's going to cost more for a while.
I'm not terribly surprised to learn that. And I do sadly remember the 80s. I was actually living in New York and standing on an unemployment line. And one thing I can tell you is I never want to have to do that again. Let's talk about those manufactured homes because I'm really interested in these. My husband's an architect. We are familiar with this genre. But I'd like to know what's a $115,000 home look like today, and what kind of land do you need to put one on?
Yeah, so maybe the land question first, Jen. You can own a quarter-acre lot in Broward County, and we can sell you a manufactured home, 12 to 1,400 square feet. That will be about $110,000 to $130,000. It's quite attractive. One of the manufacturers we work with is Clayton Homes or Colony Homes. I think people have this stigmatism about manufactured homes. They see mobile homes, which was back in the 70s. The U.S. government through HUD changed all that, and now you have regulations over manufactured homes that give you a home that'll last 50 years. I'm quite excited about it. You also have my reference to Elon Musk living in a 500 square foot home. That's designated what they call a park home, which is up to 500 square feet. Will be $50,000. And then you got a second category in the U.S. called tiny homes, which are 500 to 1,000 square feet, and they all have three different purposes. But I think it's the solution for affordability. The traditional home today is $150 a square foot to build. A manufactured home built in a plant, same quality, maybe better quality, is $44 a square foot. And I think we're finally addressing the solution of your ability to pay for that home and not having the U.S. consumer so indebted that they can't survive a shock. Whether it's a pandemic or the Great Credit Crisis or wherever the next shock will be, we have to find a way to put people in the homes where they're not 80% indebted, because that doesn't work. And
I agree with you that I think many of us are stuck in the old mental picture, and that's not my experience as of late. And so I'm really excited about this as an option to help solve the affordability issue. You alluded earlier to you've seen strong consumer credit worthiness, which I think is great news for all of us. And my question around this is going to be, since we just had this conversation around inflation, is that going to change the picture, or do you think that the labor shortage will keep things in place?
Yeah, I think, Jane, that we're going to see labor costs go up. So you're going to pay more per hour for that skilled, semi-skilled labor, which should benefit consumers. So they'll have more free cash flow to pay back their various bills. So that's a positive. The potential negative here is interest rates increasing. A lot of talk about the Fed tapering, which is a lot of technical language for interest rates probably going up this fall. But there's so much cash in the U.S. banking system or in life insurance industry or other spots. I think that's going to tamper the increase in interest rates that the consumer are going to see. Mortgage rates are at all-time lows. I think that's going to continue for a while. So I think the consumer is going to be in great shape here for the next 2 or 3 years. Now the consumer will be buying, whether it's Freon or that new replacement window they want, is going to be more expensive. But I think they're going to be ahead of that curve here for at least the next 3 to 4 years. So I think it's a good time for the U.S. consumer. For Canadian investors, ECN is a lens into the U.S. consumer and the U.S. credit markets. And I think we're in very good shape.
Well, that's very encouraging news. And so that's all great. Let's talk about the M&A atmosphere. You have been involved in that in some company trading in ECN over the years. And how do you see the current environment for mergers and acquisitions?
Yeah, I've been doing this for a while, and the one fact that is always imprinted is that 2 out of every 3 acquisitions fail to deliver value for the shareholders. And I've been on both sides of that trade. I've done very large acquisitions. I was the guy that acquired GE Fleet. And that was, we thought we'd integrate it in 18 months. It turned out it was 3 to 4 years. We thought we'd spend 10 million integrating it. We spent 50. So those large integrations you have to be very cautious with. And I'm no longer a subscriber to large acquisitions. Now, if you acquire a smaller entrepreneurial company, which we did with Triad Homes in Jacksonville, and we've taken a $100 million business to $1 billion because there wasn't systems to integrate. We weren't taking out costs. We were taking a family-owned business, adding capital and experience and strategy, and growing that base. I think that's a much better model in acquisitions. I still live in fear of these large acquisitions that fail to produce value. They're quite hurtful to shareholders. They're hurtful to employees. The odd time CEOs will believe their own stuff. I fell into that camp for a while. So you have to get yourself out of that and think about how you create value, but start with a smaller base and think about how you can grow it organically as opposed to these large acquisitions that are all driven by cost takeout.
So when we think back to the conversation that we had with Manny and with Bill, that was really a conversation around startup. And
Right.
What advice do you have for startup that maybe create a smallish company, and they perhaps are looking for someone to help? They want to create enough value to be a buyout target.
Yeah.
What do you suggest, and what do you look for?
Yeah, good. First thing I tell you is it's okay to fail. If you're not failing, you haven't learned. And when we do due diligence on prospective investments, we look for how have you failed and how have you recovered. So that's my first screen. The second screen would be, staying focused on what your strategy is. Don't reach for other parts of the business spectrum that look attractive. And with 3 things: focus, focus, focus. And then execute on your strategy. And then make sure that you're soundly financed. So many startups, I know when I did my first startup when I was 24 years of age, it was financed on a credit card. And that wasn't the brightest thing I had ever done. So having the proper backing, even if you have to give up some equity, some control to get the proper financial backing, as long as your strategy remains on message and your execution is pristine and it's okay to fail, I think you're in great shape. But financing and having sufficient capital to execute your plan is hugely important.
So that's a really great segue into this question, which is, tell us about a failure. If everybody needs to fail, and what did you learn from it? Give us one.
Well, Jane, I'm probably the old guy in the block here, but there was one thing called the Russian ruble crisis. You go back 2 decades ago, and I was Michael Dell's partner. I created Dell Financial Services with Michael Dell, and we were financing Dell computers for consumers. Okay. And our borrowing costs went from 4.5% to the next morning they were 6.5%. And our business model had 2% of profits. So every loan that we wrote the next morning, because of the Russian ruble crisis, nothing to do with us. It was, they had a 24-year-old prime minister come into Russia, which really disrupted the credit markets. Mm-hmm. We were losing money every day. And calling up Michael Dell to tell him we're losing money any day wasn't a great phone call. And he told me to get my butt to New York and help him solve it, which I did. And that was a great learning. You have to, back to my advice to young entrepreneurs to startups, make sure you have sufficient capital. That company I was running at the time had $3 billion of short-term debt. We shouldn't have done that. We should have had $3 billion of longer-term debt and paid a bit more for it. And we wouldn't have put ourselves in harm's way and been, open to what happened in the capital markets. That was it. The technical term we use is liquidity. That just means having sufficient funds for the next 5 years. It's my fishing boat in West Palm Beach is called Liquidity.
I love that.
So we know it's going to rain. You just got to make sure you got a raincoat.
Well, that's a little bit that's the advice actually my mother gave me, was save a part of every paycheck you get.
Yeah.
And I think very few of us are trained that way these days, but it sounds like you learned that one about the way I did.
Yeah, that call to Michael Dell was not friendly. Now he was a great guy, and we went on to make some money, but that was not a good phone call.
Well, I'm glad to know that you survived it. And one quick last question. So Canadians go to the polls next Monday. What advice would you give to whoever wins that election?
Yeah, stop spending money. I have 4 children, 4 young adults, 3 of whom live in Canada, 1 in the U.S. My young adults in Canada are getting a check not to work, and they don't need a check. And we've had that issue a bit in the U.S. It's 5 times as worse in Canada. And it's time to get everyone back to work in Canada. I spent about 20-25% of my time in Canada in our head office. And it's whoever wins the election, and I'm more of a conservative than a liberal, but I no longer vote in Canada, but I would hope the incoming party, the incoming prime minister, would find a way to turn the tap off and then what money you are going to spend, put it behind your point earlier, Jane, about young entrepreneurs. Let's go find that next generation of people who are going to grow the businesses to create wealth, to create employment, to create opportunity. That's where the capital should be going. I'm sounding like a politician, aren't I? I should shut up. But,
somebody's going to tap you on the shoulder and ask you to run. Be careful.
Yeah.
Well, I will look forward to seeing you down here in Florida when you make your way back to the Sunshine State. And to Manny's point earlier, to everyone who is thinking about coming to Florida, I will tell you that it is certainly my town is an open town, and we're happy to see you. So thank you very kindly, and I'll turn the mic back to my friend Mike Finney.
Thanks, Jane.